now I would like to invite Abhishek and Abigail to the stage, and they'll tell you how they contributed to feeding Northeast Florida. Thank you so much.
Good evening, I'm Abigail, and now that we've talked about healthy children, let's go and talk about staying healthy with feeding Northeast Florida. So hunger is a giant problem internationally, but we often forget that it's right here on our doorstep. Feeding America is actually the largest nonprofit that's working to combat this issue in the United States right now. But let's focus on our state, and let me ask you guys a question. How many of you, raise your hand if you've ever lost a quarter? Yeah, so if we took the Florida average meal cost and we found all those quarters, we just fed about 13 people with just our lost quarters. But hunger is a lot more than just money, so let me ask you guys another question. How many of you passed a grocery store driving in today? Access is not something that we usually think about, but many Floridians don't have a grocery store within a commutable distance to them. There's actually overall 2.8 million people in Florida that are considered food insecure. Feeding Northeast Florida is helping to combat this problem in 8 of our local counties. They do this with over 150 partners. They are considered part of Feeding America, which has over 200 plus food banks. And they are very proud to say that just in 2018, they provided over 14 million meals. Obviously, Feeding Northeast Florida is doing quite a bit, but they are always looking to improve. So they came to us and asked us if we could visualize their data. They were hoping that with this visualization, it would support their research and help them understand food deserts more. It would help them create strategies in understanding need, and it would strengthen their overall view of their counties. So in order to do this, we decided that first we would need to consolidate our data. Then we would need to transform it, then analyze it, and lastly, visualize it. So we thought consolidating would be the easiest part, but that's before we saw the data. So the data actually came from 4 different realms of data sets. The first was regional, which included census tracts. The second was information on Feeding Northeast Florida's actual partners. And when I say partners, I mean 2 separate partners. The first are agencies, which are places like schools or churches who are willing to open their doors so that people can actually come and get the food. The second partnership are retail donors, which include grocery stores or other retailers who are willing to donate their excess food. And our next realm was the distribution numbers on the actual food that Feeding Northeast Florida was giving out. And our last section was research data. Now, after we had consolidated all the data, we had the problem of making it all uniform and easy to be analyzed. Our first problem was an indexing problem in which all data had different ID systems that we had to combine. Next, we had a quantifying need problem in which we couldn't understand what was the most important factor. Then we had a data format problem in which some of the data wasn't ready to be analyzed, it was in a report format. And lastly, our biggest problem was an aggregation problem. This meant that all of our data sources were on different levels of detail. We used GIS tools as well as writing some scripts in order to create all of our data sources on one level of detail. And now I'm going to give it to Abhishek to talk about our analysis.
So for any analysis, it's important to know your region really well. So we started by looking at the demographics. We looked at different factors which actually determine a region. Once we had a good idea about our region, we next moved to look at the need in that region, and we started to look at different factors which actually quantify this need. Once we had a good idea about the needy population, we next looked at Feeding Northeast Florida's operations. Here we looked at their partners and their distribution numbers to actually analyze the impact they're making. And we finally proceeded with ranking. We proceeded with ranking based on areas, based on their criticality. So we performed 2 kinds of rankings. One was from the data we already knew about the critical regions, which are termed as food deserts. We actually spent a lot of time doing this, but I won't be talking about it today. The other type of ranking that we performed was by looking at the demand and the supply. To estimate the demand, we looked at research data from reports which actually focus on need. And to estimate the supply, we took in consideration feeding Northeast Florida's local distribution numbers, which makes this ranking specific to feeding Northeast Florida. We then ranked areas based on the difference between the demand and the supply. And the unit that we considered here was the number of meals distributed. So putting it all together, we developed a dashboard, which is a visualization tool for feeding Northeast Florida. So let's have a look at the tool. Here it comes. So this is the dashboard. So to go over the dashboard, let me consider a simple use case. So for example, the strategy team wants to know where they should target their efforts next based on their distribution. So let's look at the ranking based on the supply and demand. So these are the ranking based on the supply and demand. So now the strategy team can choose a metric to base their rankings on. So we have different metrics. So for this case, let's consider low access. So these are the rankings based on the low access population itself. So now let's look at which area is ranked 1. So we see it's the Bunnell area in Flagler County that is ranked 1 based on a metric of choice. So now the strategy team can relay this information to the grants team that can then look into their partners in this region. So let's look at their partners in this region. So now here we can look at the feeding Northeast Florida's partners in the Flagler region. So now if we select their partners in this region, so now the grants team can either approach these partners, or if we go back to the main screen, or they can use the first 2 sections of the dashboard for writing grants. So for example, let's look at need. So now here, if we select Flagler, so now the grants team can look at different metrics, use these visualizations along with the data to support their grants and strengthen their grants based on the data. So now let's talk about the future. So we would like to believe with our project, we have highlighted the importance of data, its better collection and maintenance. We've also promoted a data-driven strategy for grants and operations. And finally, I feel really proud saying that our partnership with Feeding Northeast Florida doesn't end here, because UNF has also partnered with Feeding Northeast Florida to work on a bigger community-based hunger network project. Thank you.